Today is August 14th, 2024, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Yesterday, I posted a talk titled How to Learn to Read Real Latin and Greek Fluently, and got quite a bit of feedback, which I am thankful for. But one of the contacts asked the question, isn't the study of Latin and Greek, isn't classical education really for character development? Isn't it really for the development of the whole person? And it's common for us to hear this kind of talk in classical education circles, where classical education is talked about as the remedy for all the problems in modern society. We're told that, the reason why our culture is so bad is because of public schools. And if we just had classical education, it would fix all that. And, I don't agree with that. I understand why school leaders and school marketing departments and marketing campaigns would like to try to promote that for the sake of increasing enrollment in their schools. But that really is not the mission of classical education. It's not for this general personal development. The problem in our society has much less to do with classical education and much more to do with the abandonment of Christianity. And when God intended to redeem the human race and cause men to become good, He didn't send classical schoolmasters down from heaven into the world. He sent Christ, and Christ taught us how to live according to God's will, modeled for us a life of charity, and gave us the Holy Spirit, established the church, gave us the sacraments, and so on. So, whenever we get into this talk about personal development, the development of the human person is sought through the Christian life. It has nothing to do with formal schooling. It has nothing to do with classical education. It has to do with Christianity. It has to do with religion. It has to do with moral philosophy, and so on. Classical education is a specialized form of education with very specific ends, and they are not general personal development. It's not a self-help program, certainly not the way of salvation. And so I want to distance myself from that kind of talk about classical education because I think it's a bunch of baloney. I think it's people who really don't know what classical education is, trying to sell something that really doesn't have any substance. I think it's people trying to sell some aspect of Christian culture while branding it as classical education. I think it's an effort for people who really don't have expertise in classical studies, but who are Christians, trying to pretend that just a general Christian education is classical education. And so I think there's a bunch of problems when people start talking about classical education as a means of personal improvement or character development and so on. We can pursue character development in 1,000 different ways. Ultimately, we're going to have to figure out where the strength to actually live virtuously is to come from, because it's not in us as we are by nature. We're created for virtue, but we're also corrupt and fallen and inclined to vice. And so the question of how we overcome that, that's a question that's answered by religion. That's a question which historically Christianity answered. So if we want to promote character development, if we want to raise good people, if we want to see human beings led to virtue, what they need is not a classical education. What they need is evangelization. We need to introduce them to the gospel. We need to teach them about God, about Christ, about his saving mission in the world. We need to introduce them to the church and to the sacramental life, and so on. That's the work of evangelization. That's the work of discipleship. It doesn't matter whether you're a poor farm kid, a wealthy politician's son, the heir of a great business empire. Every human being needs to be evangelized if they're going to be led to fulfill their end as human beings. And we shouldn't try to use that purpose as the end of any kind of education. If we're looking for marketing material, we shouldn't take the work of the gospel and pretend that our school is going to bring about the fruits that can only be born by the Holy Spirit, which can only be obtained through Jesus Christ. So, again, I want to distance myself from that false marketing of what are usually false educational programs, counterfeit classical education programs. Because in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, when I talk about classical education, I'm not talking about character development. I'm not talking about general Christian education, general moral education. I've talked about this in the past. It's not merely conservative political education. Classical education is something very practical, something very specific, and it's not for everyone. Never was, never will be. If we look back in history, back to the good old days, as they're talked about, hardly anyone had an education. Hardly anyone went to school. The whole idea that all kids go to school, that's an American invention from the 1850s, even later, really. But throughout history, hardly anyone had a classical education. If someone wanted to be a painter or a carpenter or any sort of practical worker, even though it was, in getting into the arts and things like that, even music, they went to apprenticeships. They didn't go to school. They weren't classically educated. Those students, those children who were sent for classical education were usually intended for religious vocations. And the classical educational program was intended to introduce them to the 7 liberal arts, to classical philosophy, to Catholic theology, and so on, to prepare them for the learned profession of Christian ministry, of the sacramental ministry. So in many cases, there's a connection between preparation for the sacramental priesthood in the Catholic Church and classical education. But that's because the work of the priest, the work of that religious vocation required the skills and the knowledge of that classical education. There were other professions called learned professions throughout history, and they also often began with classical education. So, for example, a career in medicine began with classical education. A career in law or politics began with classical education. The children of noblemen received a classical education because they were going to work in government in some form or another. Those were the learned professions. And they, because of the learning, because of the kind of learning associated with those different professions, they were served by classical education. And again, when we talk about classical education, we're talking about the 7 liberal arts: grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Classical philosophy, which consists of moral philosophy and natural philosophy. And then Catholic theology. In a Catholic context, there was theology, which meant the study of sacred scripture, the study of systematic Catholic theology, the teaching of the doctors of the church, and so on. And then humanities, the study of history and literature. And this was almost exclusively conducted in and through the classical languages, because the goal of this education was to learn the wisdom of the ancient Greeks and Romans. And there was a canon of the wise men that were to be studied and learned to prepare one for the learned professions. So that was the purpose of classical education. It wasn't for general character development. It wasn't something that much of the population knew anything about. It was a very exclusive form of education for young people who were being prepared for very specific offices or very specific vocations or occupations in the society. So any suggestion that classical education is some kind of solution for the public education crisis is just historically ignorant. It's really absurd. Many children are going to struggle to find a way to make a living. They're not going to have interest in a religious vocation or a learned profession, and they're going to have to find a way to make money. They're going to have to find a way, as soon as they reach adulthood, to start generating income, or they're not going to eat. They're not going to have a place to live. And for them to dabble with classical languages or with philosophy studies really puts them at risk of being left in early adulthood with no readiness for the challenge that awaits them. Throughout history, as I said, it was often the children of wealthy men who received classical education because they had no pressure for money-making. They were called the liberal arts in opposition to the illiberal arts. The illiberal arts or mechanical arts were arts that were normally pursued for the sake of money-making. And they were learned through apprenticeships, as I said before, because you have to get your hands working. You have to get into the field and get practical experience. And there was a whole process or a program within society for men to learn all of the different crafts and trades through apprenticeships. And they were sustainable. The whole idea of an apprenticeship was that it was financially sustainable. It benefited the master craftsman, and it also allowed for a penniless apprentice to earn his keep by helping, by working, and providing some labor and help for the master who wasn't interested in paying him, but was going to teach him in exchange for his help. And that's how that whole culture of the crafts got started. And the kids were given practical experience. It might start, I don't know if you've ever worked in a trade before, or really any job works the same way, but when you begin, you get handed a broom and you're told to clean up. If you get started, let's say as an electrician or a carpenter, they don't give you saws and tape measures and tell you to go start measuring and cutting things. That's not where you start. You start cleaning up. You start clearing out, vacuuming up the sawdust, sweeping the room after the craftsman gets finished working, cleaning up the shop, putting the tools away, cleaning things, and so on. And then you progress one step at a time, taking on more and more skillful tasks until you finally are capable of doing everything. And that's when you become a master and can go out on your own and do the work, actually execute the office. That's how apprenticeship works. And so for kids to learn those mechanical arts and to learn them to a degree of mastery that they can actually earn a living doing them, there's really no time to mess around. And the reason why all of the kids in our society are in school in the first place is because of a really wacky social/political dream that men had in the 1800s, which was that we were going to send all of the children to school to prepare them for democratic citizenship in an industrialized society. And so the idea is we don't need kids being apprenticed. We don't need kids learning to clean shops and help in the fields, help with barn chores and things like that. We don't need kids learning to work in the factories. What we need are kids to go to school, to learn to read and write and do arithmetic. They need to learn history. They need to learn about the country and the laws and the Constitution, because they need to participate in this American society, understanding democracy and understanding how the free market works, so they can contribute as what Mr. Potter called the thrifty working class. That was the vision for public education, and I would argue that it's largely been a train wreck, because it pulled kids, the 90% of human beings who need to work with their hands, it pulled them out of the workplace and brought them into a school environment which they really are never going to make good use of. And of course, this is my own opinion, but there's a writer, William Cobbett, who wrote back in the, 1800s. He was an English economist and politician, and he's the one who argued that 90% of people need to learn to work with their hands, and only 10% will ever be able to make a living with their intellect. And when we look in history, we see that very few children went to school, and when they did go to school, the curriculum was very specific. It was a classical curriculum, a classical education, because those kids were being trained for liberal arts. They were being trained for arts that were pursued primarily by wealthy men, not because wealth is necessary for them, but because it was men who had already been provided for materially, who could devote their lives to works that didn't necessarily have any financial pressure on them, like the priesthood, or like other political offices, or what we would call charitable works in modern society, charitable activities. Think of nonprofit organizations in modern America. That's the idea of the liberal arts. Those sorts of works that are pursued not to make a profit. They're not judged by their financial the gain that they produce. They're just intrinsically valuable works that need to be done, for which we really can't expect payment. The works of mercy, for example. So when we talk about classical education, we're not talking about an option for general education. We're not talking about an education to replace the public school program. The public school program has a specific function. It's to give sort of a basic literacy and working education that allows someone to enter into and participate in the American workforce in a productive way. And even though that's the goal, we see that even that fails terribly for 1,000 different reasons. But again, when we talk about classical education, let's not allow it to get mixed up with college and career preparation. That's really not its primary focus. If you're concerned about your child getting ready for college admission, and you're talking about a modern college or university, you can go on the university admissions webpage and see what the admission requirements are, and they have nothing to do with classical education. They'll say that a student needs to complete, 4 years of English, 4 years of foreign language, 4 years of mathematics, 3 or 4 years of natural science, 3 or 4 years of social studies, and usually that's about it. It's just the modern public school curriculum. That's what's required for college admission. So to confuse classical education with some kind of, upper class college prep curriculum, that's just really ignorant. That's not what it is. It's very specifically a curriculum for students who want to serve their generation in a specific number of different vocations or occupations, the learned professions, for example. Now, when we look at the problem that we have with all of these so-called classical schools that are starting, they're just alternatives to the public schools, and they have as their end college and career preparation. And really all they are dressed up public school programs. They've got all the basic public school subjects: English language arts, foreign language arts, math, science, social studies, and so on. It's just the public school curriculum dressed up a bit. Now, they'll make some changes, as I always explain. They'll add some history. They'll add more literature because the kids are more bookwormy. They're encouraged to read more. But other than that, that's really it. It's basically a public school education with some more history and literature and maybe some very superficial Latin studies sprinkled on top. And it's usually set in a Christian context. And, it usually degenerates just into conservative political education, basically raising kids who vote like their parents. That's not classical education. Just plain and simple. It's not classical education. Classical education is a very specific historical curriculum that serves specific goals by specific means. And these goals and means were maintained for thousands and thousands of years. It's not a Christian thing, wasn't invented by Christians, existed in the world before Christianity did. I mean, just think, Aristotle, who established the art of reasoning and the philosophical sciences, lived 350 years before Christ. So this isn't necessarily a Christian thing. It's really a philosophical thing. It's a human thing. It's an intellectual curriculum that's intended to serve a specific number of ends. It's not character development. It's not general good person development. That's not what it is. And we've got to understand that. So when we look at classical education and talk about it, and we should ask, is this form of education, is this system of education right for our family? Is it right for us? Right for our family? And I want to add one thing before I go on. I mentioned before that most of the kids in history who received a classical education were wealthy kids. They were the sons of wealthy families. That wasn't exclusive, though, because the schools, and remember, most of the countries in history were governed by kings. And the Proverbs teaches us that if you see a man who is skillful in his work, he will stand before kings. The kings were always recruiting talent from their kingdoms. They were always recruiting talent. They were always looking for gifted, talented people. Think about the biblical story of King Saul when he was being tormented by evil spirits. As soon as he started to suffer, the people around him started to search out what some remedies might be for these troubles that he had, this trouble he had with these evil spirits. And one of his servants, one of the members of his court, said, "Hey, you know what? I know a boy, a shepherd boy, who is an amazing musician. Perhaps he can play for you, and his music will sort of drive away this evil spirit." And they brought David, who was a musician, who was a shepherd boy, who was gifted musically. They brought him to play for the king. And he played his harp in the presence of the king and soothed this spiritual trouble that the king had. But we see how there was just like in modern college sports, there were recruiters everywhere. There were scouts everywhere, always looking for talent. And it was an honor to be one who could find some talent and bring that talent to the king and see the king's court improved by the find of this talent, this prospect. We see another example of this in the story of Joseph, where Pharaoh is being tormented by dreams. and the baker and the cupbearer, they're like, hey, we know a guy. There was this guy in prison when we were there who could interpret dreams. And all of a sudden, they go and find this gifted individual and drag him into the presence of the Pharaoh so he can serve the Pharaoh's needs. And another example, in Babylon, during the captivity, the same thing happened with the prophet Daniel, where the king is looking for wise young men to serve in his court, and he has this choice group of Jewish boys, one of whom is Daniel, that he brings into the palace and provides for. So in a monarchy where the king takes personal responsibility for his kingdom because he benefits as his kingdom prospers, there is a much more aggressive pursuit of talent than there is in our country, which is just crazy democracy, where there's so many other ends other than prosperity, and no one necessarily benefits by the identification of talent in our society, unless it's like sports, because we want to be entertained. But those ancient societies were different because they were governed by kings, and the king was constantly on the lookout for talent. So when a gifted individual, intellectually gifted or whatever, was found, that individual was brought into the schools because they wanted to polish that natural talent and bring it to some useful end. A good example of this, in the 1800s is St. John Bosco. He was a poor farm kid who was a devout boy, and he was intellectually gifted. And so when the priest interacted with him for catechism lessons, he could see that John Bosco was different from the other kids. He wasn't a common farm kid. He was gifted. And so that priest pulled him aside, talked to his mother, and said, hey, this boy is special. This boy can go to school. And so, even poor kids, if they showed themselves to have a real interest and ability in learning, they could be pulled aside and brought into the schools by those working in the schools or those who had connections with those working in the schools. So it wasn't exclusive. It wasn't exclusively the children of the wealthy. It was also the talented. And so, those were the kids who had the opportunity throughout much of history to have a classical education, and they were primarily educated for those liberal works that were supported and promoted by the political leaders, religious works, the works of the law and justice, political works, and so on. Medicine, I mentioned a number of them. Those were the learned professions. That's what classical education is for. It's for the cultivation of the intellect. It's to provide the basic skills, that is, the 7 liberal arts, which are necessary for philosophical, theological, medical knowledge. Medicine is just a branch of philosophy. And for the contemplative life, what was understood as a contemplative life, which could include religious life, like monastic life. A Catholic king was very interested in having monasteries filled with monks and convents filled with nuns because they prayed for him constantly. And the support of monasteries and convents was considered a religious devotion, a work of magnificence, almsgiving, done by a political ruler, a sign of his own faith and justice. So the education was for that upper-class, learned culture that governed and ruled and taught the whole society. And you may know that in medieval society, really in all human society, there are 3 basic classes. There are those who rule, there are those who pray, and those who work. Those who rule are usually also those who fight. That's why the noble classes are always associated with the cavalry and warfare and things like that. Those were the nobles, right? The warrior class. And then you've got the religious, those who pray, the priestly class, and then the peasants, the working class. And, you could also add to that slaves, but really slaves were just more or less a part of the working class. And then that's really how society divides. The working class concern themselves with mechanical arts. The ruling class and religious class concern themselves with the classical liberal arts. And that's how society was divided. Like I said, almost the entire society belonged to the working class, and then the priestly or religious class and the ruling class were very, very limited. And so those receiving classical education would also be very, very few. And that's how education normally worked. Now, we can see classical education becoming a little more popular in the 1500s when the Jesuits started their schools. And it's important to understand that their schools were primarily intended to resist the Protestant Reformation, to resist the influence of Protestantism. So it was necessary to provide classical education because Protestantism, along with the sort of secular humanism of the Renaissance and then all of the scientific revolution that came shortly thereafter, or really was already underway at the time, those three movements together made a concerted attack on Catholicism, which included classical education, Aristotelian philosophy, and so on. And so to resist those movements, those anti-Catholic movements, required really, a philosophical education. And that's why the classical education curriculum became more common in the Jesuit schools, because it was considered a remedy against the influence of those anti-Catholic movements of that period. And so classical education got a bit more generalized in terms of reaching a larger number of students. And then as time went on, that ultimately the Jesuit order got suppressed, and that just sort of vanished into thin air, disappeared. I think the Jesuit order was suppressed, like 1780s, late 1700s. So that was really just a temporary thing. But real classical education was always very exclusive and restricted to the children of the nobles and the talented from among the people in the kingdom. So when we come in the 21st century and we look at classical education and we ask, first of all, what is classical education? Well, that's very easy to answer, because we've got 3,000 years of classical education to point back to. But unfortunately, those who don't have classical education, which is almost everyone, they don't know what was done in schools all through history, and so they have no clue. But we can look back through history. We can go back to ancient Greece. We can go back to ancient Egypt. We can go back to ancient Rome, all through the medieval Europe into early American history, and we can see this continued perennial system of classical studies really until the 1800s in America, when you've got movements like the movement of evolution, which spreads through all the schools with Darwin's theory. And then you've got industrialization, and you've got all of this modernist philosophy in the early 1900s. That's where classical education sort of disappears, and even many Christians, who continue to be impressed by this materialistic Darwinian educational philosophy. And so you've got that sort of taking over the modern schools, and classical education just disappears. And now we're left with this secular, materialistic math and science education that's considered normal. And you just see human society decline. Not because every student needs a classical education, but because the leaders of society, the priestly class of society, is supposed to be studying the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy and Catholic theology. That's what Christian culture came to be. And, that wisdom at the top of the mountain, as it were, trickles down the hillsides, down into the valleys, and orders all things in the lives of the working class so that the entire society is enlightened by classical Catholic studies. Well, we don't have that today. And unfortunately, because the modern schools were so poor and there's so much discontent with public schooling, which is a totally separate problem, because again, public schooling is an invention, totally unnatural and historically unprecedented, because there's so much frustration, so much dissatisfaction with public education, this whole idea of compulsory schooling. These con men come along in the 1990s peddling this fake idea that they call classical education, and all of these ignorant families just start signing up, and there's no discernment. None of the families ask for evidence. They don't ask for any historical evidence. They don't even really think about what's being said. They're just eager for something different, and they're usually moved by a simple sort of working class Christian mindset, or a fundamentalist mindset, or a conservative political mindset, and they embrace whatever is being sold as long as it serves those other interests. You can call it whatever you want. And so we've got this embarrassing classical education movement that really initially tried to present itself as the real thing until classicists and historians started pointing out how ridiculous it was. Not just me, I started in 2008 to point out just what a bunch of nonsense was being sold, and what was amazing to me was just how quickly it was spreading, even though there was no support for it, no evidence. None of the parents were asking for evidence. It was like the emperor's new clothes, where everyone was just acting like they get it. Everyone was acting like they know it and they see it and they understand it. And no one was willing to ask any of these people selling programs, selling books, starting schools, collecting tuition. No one was willing to say, hey, do you have any evidence that what we're actually doing is what wise men did in the past? There was no discernment. It was like everyone was afraid to ask questions. And these con men, they just move into town and they're talking 100 miles an hour, acting like they know all the details, like they know what was done in the past. And the Christian community, they deserve what they got, because they just entered into it with no discernment, no questions, no examination, no request for evidence, on and on and on. And so now we've got a real mess, because we've got this whole fake classical education movement with schools all over the place, homeschool programs all over the place. And they've taken what really is an important need in modern society, which is true classical education, and they've just created this massive confusion around it. So it's almost impossible for most people to be able to sort through all of this junk and actually understand what classical education is. And that's a providential thing. I don't lose sleep over it, because I believe God allows these things as a means of rewarding those who are prudent and who seek things carefully, and as a means of confounding those who are just reckless and careless, and don't even ask questions. For all of this talk, it's just so mind-boggling. For all of this talk of the Socratic method and how we have to ask questions, no one was asking if these education gurus had any evidence for anything that they were saying. And of course they didn't. And so there was no request for evidence, no examining questions, no discerning questions. They just gobbled it all up, and it's a big train wreck. But there are some working to actually restore real classical education for the real purposes of classical education. And, in my case, I was a classicist first. I became a Catholic after I was already a classicist. So I came into classical studies really from a secular perspective. I was studying Aristotle and Cicero and Seneca and all of the classical languages and classical philosophers when I was 20 years old. And as I was getting married and starting my own family, I saw that classical education would allow me to raise my children for learned vocations, which interested me, but they would also allow me to introduce my children through moral philosophy to the classical virtues. And so, when I look at Christian society, we often find this thing where Christian children, they're either very externally devout. They may go to church, they may pray, they may even go on to religious life or whatever, or it's like they're just complete fallaways, and there's almost no middle ground. It's a very strange thing. How many Christians can you name where it's like they either raise kids who go to seminary, or they talk about how their kids have abandoned everything and they're not even living moral lives anymore. And what perplexed me about that was if we would just teach even an ancient Greek education or ancient Roman education, they effectively raised virtuous men and women by teaching them moral philosophy. And so, you can see sort of this counterfeit classical education, counterfeit Christian education, by the fact that there's no real philosophical core to it. It's this superficial balloon that as soon as it's troubled by worldly pressure, it just pops, and there's no virtue, there's no real substance to it. And as I was studying as a classicist, I was, again, in moral philosophy, in classical languages and literature, and I understood the learned vocations and how they prepared for the learned vocations, and how they also prepared for a life of virtue. Because, again, the classical studies are for men and women who are going to devote their lives to liberal works, the works of mercy and so on, public works, charitable works. So you can see this sort of empty, rotten shell that is present in what is a fake classical education, that whole core of virtue, which is an intellectual virtue, a philosophical virtue, not just training people to be good, but training people to be what Aristotle would be considered morally good, in that they understand the science and willfully seek to live according to that science. And it's really not for everyone. It's for those in positions of leadership in learned professions who then direct society under them. Now, it's interesting because when we flip to Catholic life and we learn about the laity in the Catholic Church, we read that the Catholic laity, the mission of the Catholic laity, is to direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. To direct temporal affairs according to the will of God. And so you see, the real mission of the laity is to be in a position of influence. And their influence is strategic, and it assumes a knowledge of God's will. That is, it assumes a sound knowledge of philosophy and theology. It's this Christian intellect directing temporal affairs. That's really what classical education is for. Classical education is to equip men and women to have the knowledge, to have the intellectual virtue to direct temporal affairs to the benefit of everyone under them, to the benefit of all of those who work under them, whether they be actual employees or children or just neighbors, to be able to get into positions of influence with wisdom, with real wisdom, with the 7 liberal arts, the mathematical arts and sciences, the philosophical sciences, theology, and take that knowledge into those influential positions and lead and direct temporal affairs with prudence. That's what prudence is. So that's really what classical education is for. And I don't want it to be presented or talked about as this sort of alternative to the corrupt, immoral public school system. That's really not what it is. There are other problems. There are other problems in our society. You know, I mentioned one before, taking kids out of the workplace and putting them in schools to be idle when they will never have an intellectual means of living. They're going to need to do some kind of practical skill in the market to earn a living. And rather than working to develop that skill when they're young, so that they're approaching the master level by the time they're adults, they're just sitting in desks for their entire childhood doing nothing. And then when they're 18, 19, 20, they're pushed out of this Wizard of Oz school system that they've been in, and all of a sudden they find themselves in this free market society where everyone is competing, and you have to earn a living by applying for jobs and doing work and gaining experience and gaining references and outperforming other people. And nothing of their education, nothing of their childhood had prepared them for the reality of this society that they were going to be, just cast out upon when they graduated from high school and got their useless diploma. So there are bigger, deeper problems in modern society that have to do with this idea of compulsory education, which is the real evil. This idea that all kids should be made to sit in schools for the first 18 years of their lives and then be ejected from the schools into a workplace that they're completely unprepared for, that operates on completely different principles than their school community operated on. And, that's really the source of the trouble. And it continues through the college years with all of the subsidization, the government funding of all these things. So the whole thing can be this big, giant, expensive, irresponsible mess. And even, when you look at the political crises and people protesting and all of this unrest and stuff, it's just because this culture of idleness and irresponsibility just extends into the 20s and even in close to the early 30s. And you've just got this fake life that goes on for 18, 20, 25, 30 years before all of the government funding and all of the government services and all of the institutions start to run out, and the kids just find themselves in real adult life completely unprepared. So the solution for that problem that we see so commonly is not classical education. There are many different things needed to solve those problems, but classical education needs to be left out of that discussion. Classical education is a very specific system of education that serves very specific ends and is for a limited number of people. It's for a limited number of people, gifted intellectual people who desire to study and who are capable of doing the studies that are included in a real classical study program. So don't allow this attempt to make classical education into some kind of moral training or character training that's a remedy for the immorality of modern secular society. That's not what classical education is. And as I said, there are a number of solutions needed to address those issues. But classical education really has a specific purpose, which is to lead students to study wisdom, which is ultimately the knowledge of God and His will. And wise men of the past have shown us that path. They've shown us that it begins with the classical liberal arts, which prepare us for the study of the philosophical sciences, which prepare us for the study of the theological sciences, and that is sort of the top of the mountain. And when a person reaches the end of that curriculum, not that it can ever be actually mastered, but they reach generally a working end of it, they then can serve in the most influential offices in human society, whether they be political or religious, educational, medical, and so on, legal. That's really what the classical curriculum, classical studies are for. So I just want to continue to make that clear. I'm sorry that there's so much just irresponsible con man use of classical education as a gimmick just for selling educational products or selling school tuition to communities. It really has nothing to do with classical education. If you ask questions, if you use discernment, when people start talking about these things, if you ask for evidence, as simple as that seems, no one does it. No one asks for evidence. If someone says something like, well, what people used to do was, you need to just stop them in the middle of the sentence and ask them for evidence. And when they can't give you evidence, you can be 100% certain that only a con man would talk like that. Only a con man would start making claims for which he could not immediately provide real evidence for. Who would do that? Who would ever say, what person committed to truth would ever say, oh, well, in the old days, people used to, when they had no actual evidence for what they were saying? Who would do that? Only a con man would do that. Only a con man. I would never talk to someone and say, oh, well, back in ancient Rome, what they used to do was, if I had never studied what I was saying, if I had never learned and confirmed what I was saying, how would I possibly mention that to other people or affirm that to other people when I had no evidence? You just see that these are not people who are truthful. These are people who talk first and then try to find evidence for what they say later. And that those are just not the kind of people who would be working in classical education in the first place, because people who are classically educated don't talk like that. They don't act like that. They don't think like that. They study carefully. They research. They learn. They obtain certainty with evidence, and they speak carefully about things because they're ultimately concerned with being right, with being true, with being wise. They want their works to be effective. They want to help people. They want to actually do God's will. They want to do good. They're not just trying to push their product or push their service or push their school on other people and making all kinds of unsubstantiated claims just to try and, close the deal. So I encourage you, when you hear people talking about classical education, anytime you hear them make a historical assertion about something used to be done, something used to be taught, this used to be done, it used to be organized like this, the school used to work like this, people used to do this, anytime you hear someone making those kinds of claims, raise your hand and ask for evidence, and you'll know within 10 seconds what kind of person you're dealing with. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, for example, we actually study from old texts. So when I say, in schools in the past, they studied this? Well, one way that I can prove that is because we have the books they used. We have the historic textbooks. I can show you the books they studied. I can show you what St. Thomas Aquinas taught his students because his lectures are available. I can show you in the writings of Cicero or Quintilian or other writers, I can show you what they studied. I can show you in the writings of Plato what Plato taught to his students. I can show you what Aristotle taught by looking at his works. When we study the primary sources, there's no question of what was done in the past because we're actually studying the works that were prepared for the students, prepared for the schools. Once you get to these modern, goofy, homeschool box book curriculum programs where they're just selling you boxes of all of these modern books and workbooks and all of this junk that's somehow called classical education, though none of it was even published before 2005, you should be asking questions before you go around talking about how you're giving your children a classical education. You should ask questions. You should ask, this book that was written in 2005, how would that be classified as classical education? How would that make it into the required book list for a classical education? And as I said, you'll know within a few seconds what sort of people you're dealing with. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we use primary sources. We study directly from the writings of Aristotle and Cicero and Homer and St. Thomas Aquinas, the scriptures, catechisms of the church, and so on. There's really no confusion. But when you look at other programs, other schools, and I don't care if another school wants to set itself up, or there's another homeschool program, and they want to say, we've got a great program for Christian kids. That may be true. It may certainly be better than the public school program, maybe better than a modern Catholic school. But the minute that they turn to classical education as a marketing gimmick to try to sell it and gain confidence of ignorant parents who really don't know better. Sorry, 1 second here. As soon as they try to do that, sorry about that. As soon as they try to sell it with this marketing gimmick of classical education, the red flags should go up because these are not honest people. They're not honest people. Like I said, if they were honest, they would simply say, hey, this is my idea about what would be a great Christian education. This is what I think would make for a great curriculum. This is what I think would make for a great Christian school. All of that's fine. The minute you see them shift to the dishonest marketing, making claims for which they have no evidence, you can be sure you're not dealing with people who know anything about classical education. So I just want to make that clarification, just for my own conscience sake, so I know that I have warned people, and when I see the consequences of this, I don't have to go to bed at night wondering whether I should have said something. Classical education is very, very specific, very clear, simple historical reality. Now, if you want to learn about this, if you want to get into the details, I taught a course back in 2009 for parents. It was intended for Christian parents. It was very, very simple lessons, nothing academic, nothing really intellectual, very simple and historical. And I taught a series of lessons on the history and principles of real classical Catholic education, where we go back to the ancient world, even back to ancient Israel, and we just trace the development of the classical curriculum up through history from the ancient Hebrews into ancient Greece and ancient Rome, then into medieval Europe and into America, up to the present day, where you can see the situation in education. And it's a very helpful series of lessons. There's like 16 or 17 lessons. And what I did a few years ago was just took all those lessons from that course and put them into a booklet. And that booklet is available for free on the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website. And I recommend it to you. If you find this interesting, you want to get more into this, that would be my recommendation for your first study. Again, it's a free book. So just go to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy website at classicalliberalarts.com. Just scroll down the homepage, scroll down, and you'll see the offer for the free book. Click on it. You can download a PDF copy of that book, and I would just recommend you read through it. And, that book is very popular. Those who read it always tell me how much they enjoy it. And as I said, it's not some dense, intellectual thing. It's a simple historical study with lots and lots and lots of evidence of the history and principles of real classical Catholic education, and it leads us up to the present day. So you can see where we're at, why things are the way they are, and make good decisions with respect to education in light of that. So again, if you want to try to get to it directly, you can just go to classicalliberalarts.com/free-book. Free, I don't know if it's a hyphen or a dash or if there's a difference, but free-book. That'll get you there directly. If you can't find it that way, just go to the front page of the website and you'll see a big banner for free book. Click on that and you can grab a copy. So that's it. I hope that's helpful. I don't mean to be critical, but we have to be critical. We have to be critical when people are making assertions about the history of things. We have to be critical. When someone says, oh, the saints used to, we have to be critical when people say things like that. If someone says Plato said, or the wise men said, or ancients said, or Aristotle, we have to be critical. We have to search those things out. We have to check the facts. We have to ask for evidence. And we have to identify those people who are just using gimmicks to sell stuff and make sure we don't deal with those people. Because this is serious. This is our children's education. And we've got to get it right because our kids only have one shot at an education, and we can't screw it up by not asking some questions or asking for evidence. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions about this, you can always write to me directly. My email address is wcm@classicalliberalarts.com. So any questions you want to send along. I really don't pay much attention to comments on YouTube. So if you want to communicate with me, don't comment on the video. Just send me an email and we can go back and forth as we need to. But I hope that's helpful. And if there's anything else that I can clear up, please send me whatever questions or objections you have, and I'll respond by email. God bless.